Boy, great weather. It's actually colder here than Miami, so quite a change. Well, finding Bimini, it has a special meaning to me because those scholars who have debated and discussed the idea of a relationship between the Bahamas and the Caribbean, Cuba, and Florida have gone over this many, many times in the last 60 years. And what's interesting to me is the fact that to understand this connection, or lack of connection, there's a really interesting historical model we can use, and that's the Voyage of Ponce de Leon. And I guess to advance this is this it?
Click for underneath.
Here, just make sure I have the right thing here.
Okay. It's right under here. That's how you advance it.
Oh, okay. Okay. Very good.
And there's a laser on the top.
Okay. Yeah, the lights would be good. This great aerial photograph available on Earth Google just gives you a sense of the proximity of the area, the Bahamas, over 3,000 islands, and Florida in its closest proximity, less than 50 miles apart, Bimini and Andros being some of the closest locations. But what's so interesting, this close proximity actually defies the reality of that there is a great wall, a great barrier separating the two areas. And that, of course, is the Gulf Stream. So from the standpoint of prehistoric peoples who, without sails, and even though essentially we're a maritime culture, canoe-faring cultures in both the Antilles and Florida, this is really a significant obstacle to try to deal with in terms of moving between these two areas, and including Cuba. The Gulf Stream is such an imposing current that if you were able to take your canoe out far enough coming from Florida to the Bahamas, it seems unlikely in terms of reasonableness that you could really deal with the strength of that current. Likewise, coming from the Bahamas, going to Florida, even if you were setting a course due west, there's no possible way you're going to end up in a due west location. So knowing that this obstruction was a great part of understanding the either the diffusion that may have occurred or the lack of diffusion, that was a beginning point in terms of understanding the physiographic and the hydrological aspects of understanding the connections between these two areas. So I looked to Ponce de Leon. We all know Ponce de Leon from our Florida studies. There's probably more mythology about Ponce de Leon than there is actual recorded history. And the reason that the history is so difficult to get a hold of is because his original letters and manuscripts, his logs, have all disappeared. We know that there was a historian, Herrera from Spain, who actually did writings about Ponce de Leon, and we know he was actually reading the logs. He was reading the letters, but he apparently never returned them to the archives. So since 1601, there has been no information directly found about Ponce de Leon in terms of his writings. He was a very interesting man. He was at one time the governor of Puerto Rico. Apparently he came to the New World. Some people thought, again, one of the myths, that he had come on one of the Columbus voyages. He ended up being a captain or the head of a portion of what is now Hispaniola or Haiti as part of coming over. But apparently he came over in 1502 or 1504 and immediately was given this role of directing one of these provinces, which at that time had a large population of Taino Indians. As a reward for that, the King of Spain gave him a charter to go to Puerto Rico and to conquer Puerto Rico. And apparently he was very well connected to the king. And again, that's interesting because he seems to have been from an upper class family. But again, his exact ancestors are not clearly identified. But there have been people in the past who have written that he was born out of a very common family, that he was a squire to a knight. Those things seem not to be an accurate description of his background. We know that he became very familiar with the Tainos from his trip to Hispaniola and eventually to Puerto Rico. And the intrigues that were part of being part of the Spanish colonial world were really very interesting, because here is Ponce de Leon in Puerto Rico as governor for several years, but there are people who are trying to remove him from that position of power and authority and eventually succeed, and another person comes in to succeed him. Well, the King of Spain has a very good relationship with Ponce de Leon. There are letters indicating that he likes this man a great deal. He obviously knew him well in Spain. And feeling bad about these intrigues, he contacts Ponce de Leon while he is the governor of Puerto Rico before he leaves, and he says, I would like to make an offer to you. I will give you a contract to do an additional exploration, an additional conquest, in a place that I think would be of very great interest to you. And that place is called the island of Bimini. Now, for most of us, and through my life growing up in Florida and reading the school books and so forth, I just assumed that Bimini was the Bimini that we know today in the Bahamas. That apparently was not the case. But what's so intriguing about this letter is that in this charter that is offered to Ponce de Leon, there is mention of the island of Bimini in terms of a very important place, a place with secrets. He actually uses the word secrets. And he doesn't say what the secret is. This is the King of Spain writing this. And it is this point, this very murky point, that many historians believe is the origin of the story of the Fountain of Youth. Now, the Taínos populated through the Greater Antilles and through the Bahamas up until the time of contact. We know that when Columbus arrived, these were the first people that he encountered, specifically on what we now know as the island of San Salvador. And they greeted him with a great deal of curiosity and with a great deal of friendship and offered many, many goods. And in return, the contract that Columbus received from the king was to allow him to enslave what we now know as the Lucayans. The Lucayans, by the year 1520, from an estimated tens of thousands of people across the Bahamas, had been decimated totally from those islands. Likewise, in Cuba and Hispaniola, we know that the peopling of those islands, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands apparently. So what this really was the great Holocaust, the great American Holocaust. So by the year 1525, almost all of the Native Americans of the Greater Antilles and the Bahamas are gone. They're taken as slaves to be put onto plantations in Hispaniola for the various crops that are being introduced. They're used in gold mines in Cuba and Hispaniola, which quickly give out. They're also used as divers for pearls off the coast of Colombia. And it's very apparent that Lucayans and the Taínos now are a human commodity. So many of them are killed that those who are captured, many of them decide to commit suicide rather than to die in the mines or in the plantations. But the importance of the Taíno connection is that Ponce de Leon and the King of Spain know about this place called Bimini that is beyond what they have already conquered and have taken control of. Now, what's interesting is that Christopher Columbus and his family have the charter for Hispaniola and for the Bahamas. They already have that. They already have the promise of all of the riches and all of the people that they can possibly use as slaves. And so when this contract is offered to Ponce de Leon for the island of Bimini, it is very clear that it is not talking about the Bahamas, because the Bahamas are already spoken for by the Columbus family. And the son of Christopher Columbus, Diego Columbus, petitions the king and he says, you know, this contract you're giving to Ponce de Leon, I really think that we should have it. We can do an excellent job in taking care of that new part of the world that you're so interested in providing riches. For whatever reason, the king had no interest in further empowering the Columbus family. So he was very anxious for Ponce de Leon to receive this charter. The contract has 17 different clauses. It includes that Ponce de Leon will get 90% of all of the gold and riches that are found, and that the King of Spain will only get 5% originally in the first year, and that percentage increases each year until eventually it gets to, I believe, 10%. Or I might have that in reverse. It might have been 10 the first year, but it's incremental. He also says, you know, all of those people, we know there's going to be Indians there. Those people will belong to you. You can use those people as slaves, just as has occurred in other parts of the Antilles. So Bimini is already being divided up as this potential new focus of wealth in the New World. And the Taínos, in terms of their knowledge of this place beyond the Bahamas, are responsible for somehow getting this information either to Ponce de Leon directly or through other Spaniards, because eventually the King of Spain is aware of this place. And this is why it's obvious that somebody has traveled between the Bahamas and Cuba and Florida, because there is this knowledge of Florida as a separate place. Now, of course, at that time they thought it was an island. Now, the other possibility is that even though we give credit to Ponce de Leon as being the person who discovered Florida in 1513, it's possible that the knowledge of this other place, this other island, was a result of some other ship, another Spanish ship, that might have just strayed off course or was shipwrecked, or somehow saw and sighted this, the Florida coast and brought that information back to the other Spanish colonies. We don't really know. But there is a strong possibility that it is linked to this knowledge that the Lucayans might have had. And in fact, we know that when Ponce de Leon began his his voyage, he stopped at a camp or a village in the Bahamas and actually picked up somebody as a guide, a Lucayan Indian. I was fortunate enough to work on this project in Eleuthera, the Preacher's Cave site. And you can see it's a beautiful, beautiful cave. If you were going to pick a setting for Treasure Island, the movie, this is the place you'd want to pick. The Bahamian government asked the Conservancy that I work with and some of our co-researchers to go to Preacher's Cave because for the Bahamian government and for the people of the Bahamas, Preacher's Cave is probably the most historic site in all of the islands. And the reason is because this is the site where the first white colonists arrived in the Bahamas for the first permanent settlement, which was in the year 1648. And these people were called the Eleuthera Adventurers. Now, they came to Eleuthera, which was their name for the Greek word freedom. And these people were Puritans. They actually came from Bermuda and from England with a charter to settle Eleuthera for religious freedom and for economic opportunity. The Bahamian government was anxious to get this history documented archaeologically. They already had some records that had been used over the years in terms of the history books in the Bahamas, but nobody had ever done a documented systematic excavation of the cave. So although our focus was on the Eleuthera Adventurers, what we discovered was there was, not surprisingly, a Lucayan, an Indian component to the site. And this is a laser map that was done for us by Laurie Collins from the University of South Florida, who came out and helped us. And you can actually see the contours of the floor of the inside of the cave. And why this is important is because, no surprise, if you're in the Bahamas and you got a giant cave, well, you're going to have a lot of people treasure hunting thinking that they're going to get rich in a place like this. So we were trying to identify the areas that had already been disturbed by treasure hunters. And this contour map became a valuable tool in selecting some of the locations that were least disturbed for excavation. Now you can see where the arrow is pointing in the back chamber of the cave. When we excavated that unit, this is what we found. We found the remnants, the remains of 3 individuals, the best preserved human remains, Lucayan remains, that have ever been documented in the history of the Bahamas in terms of the archaeology. There are many, many burials and human interments that have been found in the so-called blue holes, and some of you might have actually seen the NOVA special last week on the blue holes and some of the human remains that have been found there. But the human remains that have been found in the blue holes are always out of context, either because the bodies were dropped in the water or frankly because of poor recovery. In this particular case, we actually found that these burials had not been disturbed. And what was remarkable about these burials was the fact, number one, there was a cluster of 3 of them. And let's see how this... I thought maybe the... I'm not familiar with the laser here, so... Well, you can see the one individual in the lower part of the image, and there's a Triton shell buried with that individual. In the back of the cranium, the back of the head, you can see there's a little area of green. Well, that was a group of Tellan shells. There were exactly 28 shells buried that apparently were inside some kind of sack or some kind of holder that had been tied to the back of the head or probably in the hair. The individual directly above that, that parallels that, is a woman. The first individual I described as a male. But what's really interesting is the individual who's crossing to the far right. If you look carefully, the first thing you might notice is there's no cranium. When we uncovered those remains, the speculation was that some treasure hunter had been there and had already found the skull and taken the skull out. But I could tell from looking at the context of the burial that that was not the case. So I had some real interesting arguments with our osteologists and our field people. And I said, no, that's been deliberately removed before this person died or when this person died. And the other thing that was incredible is if you look at that, the arms are actually bound. You can actually see. We found remnants of the cordage tied around the wrist of the individual as well as around their chest. So it would appear that this person was not a willing victim for whatever sacrifice or what might have been going on here as part of this interment. The radiocarbon dates indicated this was about 11 to 1200 AD. So who were these people? Who are these Taínos, these Lucayans? Well, there has been enough science done that we know that this population of people did not come from Florida, despite the proximity of the Florida Peninsula, but rather are the end result of migrations that began with island hopping from the coast of Venezuela and South America, Colombia, and Trinidad, working their way through the lower Antilles, through Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Hispaniola, Cuba, and then eventually, in their final leg of exploration or expansion, by about 600 to 800 AD, to the Bahamas. Now, did that expansion ever reach Florida? Well, we can't say categorically whether it did or has not, because frankly, with all the archaeological work that's been done in the last 100 years, we haven't found a single Lucayan artifact anywhere in the peninsula to date. So the question for Ponce de Leon was, how do I get to Bimini, and where is the gold? And part of the information that is departed to the Spanish, I'm sure, is this idea of a fountain of youth. And we think that this may be the origin of the story in terms of some of the mythology and the storytelling from the Taínos. In fact, we know from the account of Fontaneda, who was shipwrecked in southern Florida, probably in the Florida Keys, in the 1540s, eventually discovered by Menendez when he comes into Florida in about 1567, is actually freed and brought back to Spain. And Fontaneda describes a group of Cuban Indians that arrived sometime during Carlos's father's reign on southwest Florida, and allows these people, these refugees, I'm sure, to resettle somewhere in southern Florida. Nobody's ever found that particular site yet, but I'm sure it's out there somewhere. Now, what that suggests to me is that these people were actually fleeing during this great decimation of populations occurring in the very early 16th century by the Spanish. And with them comes information about the fact, hey, when these Spanish arrive, don't be so happy to see them. They're not bringing gifts. In fact, I often say to people, you know, if you were a Spaniard in the first part of the 16th century and you arrived in Florida by way of shipwreck, your life expectancy was about 3 to 4 minutes. It wasn't gonna go well for you. But people don't realize that the savagery and the hostilities that were encountered by the Spaniards probably had a lot to do with the legacy that had preceded them in terms of the Taínos and the Lucayans who might have escaped and actually arrived in Florida as part of that refugees of people who had survived. This is an idea of what Florida looked like in the Bahamas relative to mappers in 1650. They did their best to depict the greater islands, and they even have, by 1650, they have Bimini actually identified as one of the Bahamian islands. But that certainly was not always the case. Now, this is roughly the route of Ponce de Leon's 3 ships, and he ends up somewhere up there near St. Augustine. Again, hey, great myth. You go to the Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine, and you get to see where the Fountain of Youth is. Well, no one should be surprised that this is Florida, and can't always believe what you hear, but this is the early map that some believe had some direct relation to information provided by De Soto. And what's great about this map is that you see up on the right-hand corner, right there, it's blurry because it just didn't hold up in the blow-up. But that writing says Bimini, Florida, formerly Bimini. That's what it says. So it actually is the documentation that Bimini was actually Florida. It was always considered to be what is now the peninsula of Florida. And they cross that out, and it becomes Florida because Ponce de Leon lands there in early April. 1513, he calls it La Florida, becomes Florida. Suddenly Bimini becomes the little place, the little tiny island in the Bahamas. And boy, I'll tell you, you want to talk about a great archaeological discovery. 1909, the gentleman who owns this property, Fountain of Youth Park, he said, hey, you know what, the anniversary is coming up in 4 years. People are saying that this may not be the site of where Ponce de Leon landed. Well, I'm going to settle that for them. So he discovers the original cross right next to the fountain. And you know, Bob Austin and I, we are always in situations where we have to excavate units, but nobody has ever dug a more perfect unit that actually fits the cross. I mean, they landed right on top of this thing. And I think there's enough suspicion here to probably realize that some of the workers got this laid out the night before. This becomes the namesake for Ponce de Leon in Florida. This is a 1930s view of it, all grown over. Nice reconstruction of the landing there, looking down at the well, the spring. And of course, a great tourist attraction that eventually has hundreds of thousands of people come to it. Well, historians and scholars have not been so quick to accept that the Fountain of Youth, or that the first landing of Ponce de Leon was exactly at that location, and not even in St. Augustine for that matter. And of course, you can see they gussy it up really nice so everybody feels good about getting some of that water. And by the way, in Bimini, the island Bimini, there's another Fountain of Youth on South Bimini. So there's some competition going on about where you should be drinking the water. And by the way, we didn't see anybody over 40 on this island, though. Lindsay Williams, from, who I thought did a very admirable job in terms of reconstructing early landings and explorations in Florida, he produces this very interesting map where he decides or determines where he thinks Ponce de Leon's voyages actually were, where the landings were. Somewhere near St. Augustine. We know there's a Cape of Corrientes, the Cape of Currents, and lots of scholars now think it's probably Cape Canaveral, which is just south of where the landing occurs. There's also the possibility, the only other major cape is Cape Florida, but that seems way too far south. Cape Florida is Key Biscayne, because then all these other sites then fall way to the south. And this is an important site because this is the River of the Cross. This is where a stone cross is actually placed. Well, not exactly placed. There were a lot of problems with the Indians because the Indians were not happy about the Spanish landing, so they were shooting arrows all the time at them. So they decided the best way to dispose of the cross was to drop it off in the water offshore from their ship or from one of their boats, at least according to Herrera. So it seems like where they dropped it off, which they called the River of Cross, the River of Cross being either St. Lucie Inlet or Jupiter Inlet, because when you enter, you can look to the right and left and there's a river on either side, or you can go straight. So it's like a three-way convergence of these freshwater streams. So those are probably the places where one of those two is going to be the most likely location. In the first voyage, Ponce de Leon continues around the Florida Keys. He comes up, lands somewhere on the west coast. A lot of people think that that might have been at Pine Island. And in fact, there's even reports of so-called Ponce de Leon objects or features having been found at Pine Island. A lot of people don't know there is a second voyage of Ponce de Leon that occurs in 1521. And it is on that second voyage where he makes a beeline for the west coast of Florida with the idea of colonizing of southern Florida. He brings colonists and he brings priests, where he is mortally wounded and actually eventually dies from his wounds. One of the place names, Santa Marta, is of interest to me because it's Key Biscayne. And if you are an archaeologist and you're focused on this kind of landing site, of course the problem is these kind of artifacts or these kinds of physical evidence are going to be very, very elusive, very difficult to demonstrate. I will tell you that there is one very enigmatic site that was found in Broward County in Fort Lauderdale called the Bonnet House site. And what made that site unusual is that it's on the barrier island, and we were doing a phase 1 survey for the Bonnet House, which is a beautiful mansion that's preserved on about a 40-acre tract. And as we were doing our shovel testing, we came across a mound of conch shells. Well, that's not unusual on a prehistoric site in Dade County, but I hadn't really seen anything like it. It was about 23 or 24 conch shells, and it was a small little pile that was about 2 feet high and about 3 feet in diameter. And as we uncovered it, you could see the pile was getting larger and larger, and you can see the drawing of it over there. But there's something was odd about this particular pile of conch shells. There were a lot of oyster shells around, but these shells were different. These shells were opened in a way that I had never seen before on any prehistoric site on southeastern Florida. If you know anything about conch shells and you're someone who likes to eat conch, you know that you have to open the shell or remove the gastropod by breaking a hole in the crown and removing the muscle. This person, or these people, did not do that. They did not break a hole in the crown. Every one of the shells had a huge hole similar to this broken into it. I looked at that, I said, boy, I mean, these people don't seem to know what they're doing. Then this was the real clue. We found a sword or knife blade hole in one of the conch shells. Somebody in just utter frustration apparently stabbed one of these things, or who knows why. But when I saw that, I realized, you know what, these are not Indians. These are Europeans in all likelihood. And at first I said, well, you know, it's not impossible. It could be one of the early landing sites because whoever landed here as Europeans, they didn't know anything about how to open a conch shell. So obviously they hadn't been in the Caribbean. Well, that eliminated Ponce de Leon, who had spent a lot of time in the Caribbean and Puerto Rico. So who could it be? Well, the truth is we don't really know. There were no other diagnostic artifacts found. There was a piece of lead slag, but when we did a radiocarbon dating of a series or grouping of these shells, the range of the dates turned out to be between 1480 AD and 1540 AD. That was the range. So the average age was about 1520. So the suggestion here would be that these shells were probably food refuse from some group, whether they were shipwrecked or whether it was a deliberate search for food and water, probably around 1520, but obviously a group of people who had never been to the Caribbean. They could have been Spaniards who had come over for the first time, but that was not the normal route they used to get to the New World. Or, maybe more likely, they were English or French or Dutch. We just don't know. So there are always more mysteries and unanswered questions than there are clear answers to all of this, and that's part of the fun of looking at this kind of thing. Now, when you start to compare and you realize the issues that were involved for Ponce de Leon to come over to Florida, and not only in terms of knowing ahead of time that there was something there, but the fact that there was some kind of information going back and forth, let's take a look at what Native Americans had in terms of their assemblage and compare the areas and see what how they're similar and how they're different. On the top is a very typical Taino basaltic axe or celt, beautifully made out of greenstone. They're not, some people used to call it jadeite. It's not really jadeite. Most of it is basalt. And of course, typical of southeast Florida are conch shell celts, and this has a wooden handle that's been added. It's not authentic. And then look at the distribution. The Taino celts of stone, they're petaloid celts in the shape of, as you saw, long leaf, very particular looking, and they're found all through Hispaniola, Cuba, the Bahamas, but none have ever been found in Florida. Aware of. Now, that was true up until 1986. In 1986, I got a phone call from a park ranger at Key Biscayne, and he was very excited because he had found these stone artifacts while he was cleaning, doing some cleaning. outside the lighthouse there. And when I arrived and I looked at him, he had one of these stone celts. I was amazed. I said, well, this is it. This is the proof. This is the connection in terms of Taínos possibly either trading or landing in South Florida. Well, my eager excitement was soon abated when, with a little more research and time, we got another call about some other beautiful basaltic objects found in a park, Jose Marti Park on the Miami River. And now it became clear what was going on, as I soon discovered going into Little Havana, into the Botanicas, is that in the Botanicas they were selling these as medicine, as part of Santeria rites. And the cache that had been found in Key Biscayne was actually placed there by somebody from Haiti or Cuba who was practicing Santeria. So now, anytime you find these things in South Florida, you better assume it's probably contaminated or brought in, because now there are actually hundreds of these celts all through Miami that have been used in these various rituals. Another typical artifact related to the Lucayans is palmetto ware. The pottery is very distinctive because there is no really good quality clay in the Bahamas. They use a red earth, they call it pineapple holes. It's a very loamy earth, and to hold this together, they add pieces of limestone, which they have a corollary here in the West Coast, and often a lot of fragmentary shells. Well, this kind of very coarse-looking shell tempering has never, and Bob, you can tell me if you've ever seen anything like it. No one's ever found anything like this in Florida. Now in Florida, in South Florida in particular, you have a type of pottery called glades tooled rim. It's very interesting the way it's formed. It's, you can see the dates about 1400 AD through European contact. It's a very shallow type of bowl. Well, now we're going to talk about some things that are similar. These two bowls, you can't see it too well, but it has the same ticking, the same shape of the rim, were actually found near Guantanamo, Cuba, in the southwest coast of Cuba. Frankly, almost identical to some of the bowls, at least superficially, similar to what I've seen in South Florida. Here's the distribution of the two bowls. So there's not much of a connection. You'd expect if there's some kind of diffusion going on, these bowls would be found closer to one another. Well, interestingly enough, John Worth, who had worked at Pineland, actually just finished a paper with another gentleman where he looked at some of these similar ceramics from Cuba in the same area, and he determined that they chronologically really did not match. And therefore, he thought that the connection or similarities were coincidental. Now, that includes these boat-shaped vessels. This one's from Cuba. And you can see, notice the little lugs at the top, and you can't see it too well, but it's kind of a elliptical shape. Well, here's the Florida Corollary. This is found all the way from Surfside in Miami Beach, all the way through Key West, along the coast to Marco Island. It's only found in a late context after 1400 AD through the period of contact. And again, you can see the distribution where these two are found. Interestingly enough, the Florida version, even though you see it kind of going crosshatched through all of southern Florida, has actually only been found on the coast, which is kind of interesting in itself. But there's two explanations here. One is that the glades tooled pottery and the pottery of Surfside actually may be influenced or affected by these late Taino immigrations that may have occurred as a result of the extermination and collecting of slaves in the early 1500s. It may be that we're actually looking at not only people that might have brought over some of this pottery, but actually affected or influenced other people in the group in terms of creating a very similar ceramic type. Now, the other possibility, interestingly enough, is that beginning in the year 1709, all of the Native Americans of South Florida by that time had been reduced from many, many thousands to only several thousands because of a combination of diseases. But beginning in that year, attacks from Indians coming out of Georgia and out of the Carolinas, launching slave raids into southern Florida. They began collecting these people, enslaving them, taking them to the Carolinas for rice plantations and indigo plantations. And in 1709, the remnants of the Duquesne and the Calusa actually petitioned the governor of Cuba and asked if they could be rescued and taken to Cuba so they could be spared enslavement. So between 1709 and 1763, several thousand Florida Indians were actually taken in boat lifts going the other direction to Cuba and relocated into 3 different Florida Indian camps. So it's possible that some of this pottery could have actually come from some of these immigrations. We don't really know. We don't really have enough information yet. Now the other clue for the difference is the lack of diffusion or connectiveness, taking the argument back the other way, is this animal, the hutia. The hutia is a small rodent. You can see it's only found in the Bahamas and Cuba, and it was always associated with prehistoric sites in the mid. And some people think they were raising them, and not just as pets, but actually as food, and carrying them with them. But none have ever been found in Florida. But I'll tell you, I'm not sure that everybody's always looked. Now, we've had a lot of column samples looked at by zooarchaeologists, but so far, no hutia bones have been identified. The Lydia snail is fascinating because there's a connection between the ligulous snails of Cuba and those of South Florida. There's some increasing evidence to suggest the ligulous snail may have come into Florida relatively late, but they're found in all the tree islands and they're found in all of the tropical hammocks. But interestingly enough, not in the Bahamas. The raccoon, only in Florida. No raccoons in the Bahamas or Cuba, at least not during prehistoric times. The deer, only in Florida. So you can see that Gulf Stream barrier was a really significant one. It was enough to stop the diffusion of movement of a lot of these animals that are commonplace in Florida. I close with this slide because wouldn't it be interesting that in the miscommunications that may have occurred between the Spanish and the Lucayans and the Temucans and all the people of Florida, the native people, when they were talking about eternal life, when they were talking about rejuvenation, what if they were really talking about life after death, the immortality of continuing through your soul, and that all of these springs they're referring to are really Little Salt Springs and War Mineral and Windover, the places where we know, at least in archaic times, hundreds and hundreds of people were interred as part of normal custom. Now, I'm not saying that that is the case, but I bring that up wouldn't that be interesting if that was really what was intended by some of those early ideas about the fountain of youth. At this point, I'm going to close the formal part of the talk, but if there's any questions, comments, this is a good time. Well, there's been very little in the way of actual evidence of cultural materials that might have been common to Mesoamerica and actually found in Florida. There's been a lot of speculation of connections, particularly in the format of the mounds and so forth, but really no hard evidence. Now, I know Bill Marquardt actually found some ceramic bowls that were identified as being from Guatemala, so things have been found. I actually saw in the Everglades artifacts found that were Mexican, what they call hoe money, little copper pieces that were pendants, and they were definitely very, very old. They didn't seem to be from the contact period, the historic period. There are these little clues that something was going on, that things had happened. But maybe the real question is, all right, suppose these connections have occurred in the past. What was the significance of those connections? Did it really affect culture in any degree, one way or the other? If it's true that there were immigrations of Lucayan and Taino people going into Florida about 1500 AD because of the Spanish conquest, they may have had a big effect in those particular years in a lot of different ways, but we don't really know. We haven't really found that evidence. That's a good question. There is some evidence to indicate, particularly in Cuba, where some radiocarbon dates go back to 2000 BC. There was a so-called very archaic-like people called the Siboney who lived in western Cuba near Pinar del Rio. And these people had no pottery. They were basically a shell culture. And there are people who have suggested that this archaic people of Cuba actually did come from Florida at a very ancient time. But if they did, they didn't bring any lithics with them. They didn't bring any of the stem projectile points. So part of the difficulty is when you see things that look similar in terms of artifacts between these areas, part of it could be environmental determinism. I mean, if you have a lot of shells around and there are only certain kinds of things you can select for making tools, things are going to start to look very similar. And often designs on pottery can look very similar. You can take a design from some parts of Florida and you could do a match with this particular design all over the world. There are types in Africa and Asia that are very similar looking. But obviously in Haiti, they look at these artifacts as being power objects. And interestingly enough, those Taino pendants, the petalloid celts that we're talking about, in the Bahamas, they're very special for the Europeans and for the blacks who live in the Bahamas. When they find one of these, it's regarded as, they call it a thunderstone. And what you do with it, traditionally, you would take it and you would, because there's a lot of boat building in Abaco and Eleuthera, you would put it under the mast of your ship to, as a ritual offering. So a lot of these celts in the Bahamas got redistributed after ships might have been wrecked or rotted away and the celt would fall out. So there's a very interesting local tradition. Well, I want to thank you for this chance to share with you, and I hope you all enjoyed it.